In order to start, and as I mentioned, we're really going to center it first on your text, the 100-Year War on Palestine, and hopefully sort of have a conversation of sort of the current political climate, the genocide in Gaza. In your book, you speak of Zionism not only as a nationalist movement, but as a settler colonial project. That's written in the title of your book and in the name of it. These you sort of describe as existing simultaneously, and you describe how Palestinians find themselves in this bind, sometimes a triple bind after 1917. So can you speak more to the importance of where you situate this history in 1917, where you start this history on this war on Palestine, to better help us sort of contextualize understanding Palestine?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Linda. Thanks, Mohammed. And thanks to all of the units that made this event possible. It's encouraging in the climate that we live in the United States, which is one of visceral hostility of the administration of many powerful forces in our society, to any mention of Palestine, to any discussion of Palestine, to be able to talk about this book at a major university like Michigan State. So I'm very grateful to you all for providing this opportunity, especially at this very fraught time. I'm speaking from New York, adjacent to Columbia University, which I think is the epicenter of the targeting, not just of Palestine activism, but of any attempt to talk about Palestine, to talk about this genocide, to talk about the history, the culture, the background, Zionism. And this is all, in fact, part of a larger agenda, which we can talk about if there's time, where Palestine is just an element of the things that this administration is targeting. So to answer your question, I titled the book "The 100 Years War on Palestine: A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance" because every one of the terms in that title and subtitle, I think, has importance in terms of challenging false received views about what is going on in Palestine. What is going on in Palestine is not just an issue between two groups. There are two groups, and there's clearly an issue between them. Both have national aspirations. Zionism is, among other things, obviously a national project. The Palestinians have had a national project for well over a century. But that's not all this is. This is not France and Germany. This is not two states. First of all, these are two entities on a completely unequal level. One has been a state for 77 years. The other group has never had independence, sovereignty, statehood, or self-determination. Moreover, what's going on is not just a struggle between them. What's going on is something that is occasioned by, manipulated by, and in some cases waged by the great powers. This was not just the Zionists against the Palestinians, or the state of Israel against the Palestinians, or against the Palestinians and some of their Arab supporters. This was the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland at the time, the greatest power on earth, championing a project which existed, the Zionist project, but which became a part of an imperial project, which ultimately waged war on the Palestinians. If you look at the beginning of my book, what I talk about as the first declaration of war on the Palestinians, it's not some statement by the Zionist Congress in Basel in 1897. There's a background before 1917. It's the Balfour Declaration, in which Britain commits itself to basically eliminate the Palestinians and establish in their place a Jewish state. The term Jewish state is not in the Balfour Declaration, but that's what the British meant. That's what they intended. And that's what their army was there to do. And so what I argue in this book is that this war has not just been waged by the Zionist movement, or later the State of Israel, on the Palestinians in order to do what one early Zionist leader, Zev Jabotinsky, called the transforming the land of Palestine into the land of Israel. It's not just a Zionist project. It was a British project, and it has since become an American project. The war on Gaza was not waged by Israel by itself. Israel would have had no 2,000 or 500-pound bombs. Israel would have had no F-35s, F-15s, F-16s. Israel would have had no Hellfire missiles. It would have had no, I could go on and on and on. All of the weapons much of the money, all of the political support was American. And that's been true for a number of Israel's wars. They were supported in different ways by the great powers of the day, whether it was Great Britain or during the period of Israel's establishment and the partition resolution just before that, both the United States and the Soviet Union, or whether it was Britain and France during the Suez War, or whether it has been since the 60s, the United States. This has been a war on Palestine waged not just by Israel, but by the great powers that have supported it since the very, very beginning in 1917. The second element in the title of settler colonialism has to do with an essential feature of what the Zionist project was about. And what I do in the book is to lay out ample evidence of how early Zionist leaders and early Zionists saw themselves as settlers and colonialists, saw that their process was a colonial process. They understood themselves as Europeans coming with a right that they saw going back to the Bible, but they saw themselves as Europeans coming to take over in the way in which settler colonial projects did in Algeria or South Africa or other parts of the world, a land whose inhabitants could essentially be pushed aside, ignored. And that has been a feature of Zionism ever since the beginning of its establishment in Palestine, with the support of this great imperial power starting in 1917. Finally, the term resistance, I think, is extremely important here. And I don't just quote what Palestinians have said about what they were doing. I quote, again, what early Zionist leaders said, in particular, Zev Jabotinsky, who's the founder of the political trend that has dominated Israeli governments since the 1970s, what later became the Likud party. Prime Minister Netanyahu, Prime Minister Sharon, Prime Minister Olmert, Prime Minister Shamir, Prime Minister Begin. They were all members of this party. And this is a party that grew out of Jabotinsky's thinking. And Jabotinsky said, this is a colonial project. No colonized people has failed to resist. Of course, the Arabs are resisting. They have to resist. It's necessary. It's inevitable. And I try and use this to show that the framing of this, as colonial powers will do, as banditry or criminality, which is how the British described resistance to their colonial rule in Egypt or in India, for example, is an attempt to delegitimize the natural, normal resistance of colonized peoples to their colonization. The term of art today is terrorism. So anything that Palestinians do to resist colonization, whether it's peaceful, BDS, demonstrations, boycotts, marches, strikes, is described as terrorism. Or violent action is also described as terrorism. And that's the way colonial powers have always described anything that the colonized do to resist the usurpation of their rights or of their land. So I think that's the thrust of the book. It explains the title. It explains the framing in terms of declarations of war on the Palestinians. The different chapters are described as different declarations of war. I think I'll stop there as far as the book is concerned.
Yeah, and I thank you for that. I think the framing of it is really important because you actually center your text on 6 declarations of war on Palestine, as you call them.
Right.
And you detail quite explicitly sort of the political making and legal justification and historical moments that legitimized settler colonialism, and pushing back against this idea that this was merely a conflict between Palestinians and Israelis as equal entities, but rather seeing it through this lens of settler colonialism and imperialism. And I say this as we at MSU occupy sort of the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Ashkenazi and the Three Fires Confederacy here of the Ojibwa, Odawa, and Potawatomi people. So I mean, our very existence here at MSU is also shaped by settler colonialism. And I think it's important to sort of see that this isn't, I think what you're trying to emphasize, this isn't really a Palestinian and Israeli conflict meeting without settler colonialism and imperialism that takes place. I want you to take us a little bit to this aspect of Palestinian resistance. And in your book, you say that, quote, the Palestinians' resistance, their persistence, and their challenge to Israeli ambition are among the most striking phenomenon of our current era. And I want to, can you speak more to this resistance and how your book sort of shows this and pushes back against this idea that generally victimizes Palestinians or sees them as, terrorists or individuals engaging in acts of violence. So how does your book show this resistance or persistence that you say challenges, I think, much of what we and how the Western narrative has been written? Rashid, you're still on mute.
I apologize. There we go. Got it. Sorry about that. First thing is, no colonized people has managed to liberate itself without violence. Even in India, assassination attempts, violent uprisings were common throughout the Raj, the period of British rule over India. We think of the nonviolent movement led by Gandhi and Nehru, but violence was an inherent part of Indian resistance to the British, and it's true in every colonial situation, whether it's a settler colonial project, as in South Africa or Ireland or Palestine or North America or Australasia, or whether it's a standard, administrative colonialism, as in India or Egypt or Nigeria or many other places. There always is resistance. And that resistance takes various forms, often violent. In fact, almost invariably, violence is a part of that resistance. That's just the nature of colonialism, because colonialism can only impose itself via massive violence. I'm working now on the theoretical roots of British counterinsurgency as part of a book I'm writing. And the degree to which British officers were taught not just to use violence in imposing British control or in suppressing rebellions and revolt, but to use violence against civilian populations is absolutely striking. That's the thing that's elided from the picture. We hear about the violence of the IRA or in Ireland, or we hear about the violence of the FLN in Algeria, or the violence of the South Vietnamese or the Vietnamese National Liberation Movement. But the violence of the colonial power is always airbrushed out of the picture. I mean, what was necessary to expel 750,000 Palestinians in 1948 was massive violence. What has been used to keep Palestinians down ever since then is massive, unending violence. The colonial power has to use violence to maintain its control. And that breeds resistance, necessarily and inevitably, whether it's armed resistance, whether it's nonviolent resistance, whether it's whatever kind of resistance it may be. And I think that is something that, from a colonial perspective, they don't want to hear. They don't want to hear, for example, that what happened on the American frontier was the resistance of a colonized people to a process whereby their homelands were being usurped, whether it's in Michigan or any other part of North America. That was the process from the beginning to the end. And it is the case in Palestine. And there have been various forms of resistance in Palestine, really since World War I. The peak under the British was a great revolt from 1936 to 1939. I talk about that in the second chapter of the book, and the first chapter of the book. The Palestinians rose up in revolt, and it took 100,000 British soldiers at a time when the population of Palestine was just over 1 million people. Now think about that. Over 1 million people, about half of them children, half of them, again, women. And so in a male population of 250,000, you had 100,000 soldiers and police, and the RAF, and the Royal Navy, and the police, and so on. Between 14 and 17% of the adult male Arab population of Palestine was killed, wounded, imprisoned, or exiled during that revolt of 3 years, from 36 to 39. And that's just one example of Palestinian resistance to a system which completely disenfranchised them, denied them their national rights, and was intending to hand over their country to a settler minority. And that has continued in different forms ever since. And I think it's really important, whether you approve of methods that are used by different resistance movements or not, to understand that is an inevitable feature of colonialism. The overwhelming violence of colonialism invariably leads to resistance. And you can see this in the casualty figures in Palestine, year after year after year after year. Whether you talk about the various Israeli campaigns against Gaza in the years from 2008 up until this war that started back in October of 2023, or if you look at the casualty figures today, 800 Israeli civilians or a little more than 800 Israeli civilians have been killed. About as many Israeli soldiers have been killed. And we don't even know how many Palestinians have been killed. Is it 50,000? Is it 60,000? The figures out of Gaza indicate something in that range, but the bodies buried under the rubble are uncounted. So we're talking in the range of a couple of thousand Israelis killed to 50,000, 60,000 at least Palestinians killed. And that is the kind of violence that colonialism metes out in order to maintain its control. This was true everywhere. This was true in Palestine in the 30s. This was true in Algeria. This is true in South Africa. This is true in Vietnam. The colonized resist. They suffer inordinately. And the colonizer, I mean, the United States had tens of thousands of casualties in Vietnam. The Vietnamese had hundreds of thousands. And that's always and inevitably the case. And those somehow we in this country pay a lot more attention to Israeli suffering, to Israeli casualties, to the individuality of Israelis who have either been killed or wounded or captured and are held prisoners in Gaza, than we do to the thousands of Palestinians who were arrested in Gaza, held without charge or trial, and are now being, some of them, released, or to the thousands and thousands. There are over 10,000 Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, some of whom have been tried and convicted in kangaroo military courts, but many of whom have never been tried, are being held in administrative detention. A process, by the way, which the British pioneered in India and in Ireland and imposed it in Palestine, and that has been kept by the Israeli state. The 1945 emergency regulations are still in force, imposed by the British during the Mandate, still used by Israel for things like administrative detention and detention without trial. We don't see those numbers in the mass media. We don't see those realities in the way in which our politicians spin this, invariably in favor of Israel. But that's characteristic of colonial wars. That's how the British spun their wars in Malaya and in Kenya after World War II. It's how the French spun their war in Algeria, and before that in Indochina after World War II.
Thank you for that. And then I think, as you mentioned, this interest or focus on sort of Israeli suffering in the US and the US media shows clearly, I think, what your text is showing is that Israel had the imperial backing of Great Britain, and later on more so of the United States. And so how do you see sort of currently the current genocide in Gaza and continuous annexation of the West Bank and the US's role in this? And I think you describe it at points sort of the imposition of a colonial reality on Palestine and like this post-colonial age that we see. How do you see the US's role in not only the framing of how we understand what is taking place in Gaza, but also part of this larger sort of declaration of war on Palestine that you described, the US's sort of positionality in this relationship?
I mean, this is not just a case of occupation. There are other occupations in the world today. Very few of them have lasted as long as Israel's occupation of the West Bank since 1967. But this is not just a case of occupation. This is a colonial project. And it's one which is out of place in the 21st century. The great historian and political theorist, Tony Judd, down at NYU, he's unfortunately passed away, made this very clear. He said that this is a project that's missed its time. Had they been trying to do this in the 17th or 18th century, they might have succeeded. The United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand are colonial projects which succeeded in sufficiently marginalizing and reducing the indigenous population that the settler population has completely taken over those societies. There still is an indigenous population in this country, in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and they still resist their marginalization. But it's very clear that what started back in the 18th and 17th and 16th centuries out of Europe, starting in 1492, in some areas was relatively successful. This project started, as Tony Judd said, it started late. It started at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, at a moment when colonialism was in decline, and at a moment when the idea of a people coming and taking over another people's land was falling out of fashion. And I think that that's something that people are realizing in the 21st century, not only in the global South, where they always realized it to a very large extent, but in the global North, in the places that are actually the metropole for the Israeli project in the United States and Western Europe. There's an increasing sense, especially among young people, that this is not just a war. It's not even just a genocidal war, that this is part of a larger project. And I think that the Trump plan and the welcome that the Israeli right has given to the idea of the ethnic cleansing of Gaza and it's the creation of, yet again, of Israeli settlements there, shows people what this is really all about. What is happening in the West Bank, I think, shows it as well. 40 or 50,000 people have been driven out of their homes in different parts of the West Bank. And they've been told that they're not going to be allowed to return. That's ethnic cleansing. And that's the kind of thing that happens only in a settler colonial project. Colonial states, the British in Egypt, the British in India, occasionally would move people, but to remove a group and to plant another group, settle another group in its place, that's settler colonialism. And I think people are waking up to this in different parts of the West in ways that they never would have before. Not only to the enormous imbalance between Israel and the Palestinians, not only to the fact that the United States has been putting its big fat thumb on the scale in favor of Israel for a very long time, and increasingly during this war, right up to the present, but that what's going on is a settler colonial project.
And I want to push this a little bit further to speak about sort of this raising of awareness, because we see the growing solidarity around Palestine, the growing support. And you mentioned quite frequently in your book that there's this raising awareness through this lens of equality. How do you see this resistance and solidarity movement taking shape? Do you see hope in this project? Can we use these international institutions that were created by these imperial states, whether it's the International Court for the ICJ or others that were created by the very institutions that utilize them for their benefit? Where can we see sort of this raising of awareness, equality taking shape, and the solidarity taking shape and the solidarity movement taking shape? And what mechanisms can be used to sort of bring that about?
I think you're right to underline the fact that the institutions of international legality, whether the League of Nations after World War I, or the United Nations after World War II, or the various conventions against genocide, human rights conventions, so on, were drafted by the victors to serve their interests. The League of Nations wasn't an international body that represented all the nations in the world. Most nations in the world were under colonial control in 1919 when they met in Paris. The United Nations was created by the victors of World War II to protect their interests. And international law has been shaped by the most powerful actors in the world. The United States constantly has been, the Soviet Union and the United States used to, and the United States currently has been. Again, putting its thumb on the scale in the United Nations and in every international forum to protect its allies and to advance its interests. Nevertheless, I think those institutions can be used. There's a growing sentiment globally that the unipolar world order that followed the end of the Cold War is reaching its end. That doesn't mean, I'm a historian. I don't predict the future. When it will end, I'm not going to say. I don't know. Decades, years, I don't know. But it's very, very clear, given the rise of a country like China, which has 2/3 the GDP of the United States, given the rise of countries like India, like Brazil, like Indonesia, that are huge, huge countries with enormous potential and growing economies and increasing ability to project power, that the unipolar moment that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, sooner or later is going to come to an end. That's on the international level. On the domestic level, or inside the United States and inside other Western countries, which are the bastion of support for Israel, without them, Israel doesn't exist. Without the Balfour Declaration, Israel doesn't exist. Without the League of Nations mandate, Israel doesn't exist. Without the United Nations partition plan pushed through by the Americans and the Soviets, Israel doesn't exist. Those are the birth certificates of the Zionist project as a globally supported project, and of the state of Israel. And the weapons and the diplomatic support and the financial support come from these countries in the West: United States, Great Britain, France, Germany, and so on. So what happens in those countries is of essential importance to what happens in Palestine. I only wish that Palestinians and Palestinian leaders were as aware of this as Zionists and Israeli leaders have always been. I mean, Chaim Weizmann and other Israeli statesmen, or Zionist statesmen, Weizmann becomes the first president of Israel, were abundantly aware of the fact that the Zionist project sank or swam, depending on international support. That's still true today. And so what has happened in the United States, where public opinion has been shifting quite significantly and quite rapidly, is of utmost importance. Now, public opinion doesn't control politics. Most Americans support a woman's right to abortion. There are abortion bans across half the country. Americans support a whole number of things. Public opinion supports a whole number of things that are not now law and will perhaps never be law. Public opinion is shifting in favor of the Palestinians. Majorities of Americans opposed Biden's policies when he was president, opposed selling arms to Israel. That didn't change anything. And you now have Gallup polls. The most recent one showed that more Democrats are sympathetic to the Palestinians than to Israel. I mean, this is earth-shaking. This has never been the case before, that a major political party's base was more supportive of the Palestinians than of Israel. Israel has enjoyed wall-to-wall support in every Western country since the launching of the Zionist movement. In every Western country since 1897, since the Basel Congress. They never had an unfavorable press. They never had politicians, well, there were a few, but they never had a majority of politicians who fundamentally opposed Zionism in any Western country. And that has not changed as far as the politicians and the media and the elites are concerned, but it has changed at the level of public opinion, or is changing. And it's true, you have a very large number of Republicans, overwhelming proportion of Republicans, much more supportive of Israel, according to this Gallup poll, than they are of the Palestinians. But if you look at younger Republicans or younger evangelicals, that's changing. And so young people who are exposed to social media and alternative media and who completely distrust, scorn, and have absolutely no time for the mainstream corporate media, they know better what's going on than their elders. And there's a change going on led by young people in how people view this issue. You go to the people in their 60s and 70s, they have the same views that people have had for generations in the West. You look at people at the level of high school and university and people in their 20s, and that is beginning to change quite rapidly. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. They have yet to affect the political level. They have yet to affect the mainstream media. They have yet to affect the elites who dominate our universities, our foundations, our public life. And I think it's a legitimate question when and if this shift in public opinion is going to lead to a change in policies by the United States or Britain or France or other Western countries, without whose support Israel cannot do anything that it's doing today.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think there's definitely been a shift in public opinion. Most Americans did support a ceasefire, even though the administration didn't. Yet at the same time, we see under both the Biden administration, the attacks on encampments and academics, and currently even more so under the Trump administration. And now with the current arrest of Mahmoud Khalil at Columbia. And I want to sort of ask you, and I know there are various students and activists here listening and paying attention. What can we say to activists, particularly I would say students, many, as I mentioned, who are probably in our audience, about any advice, suggestions to give them involved in their mobilization, as we see sort of administration sort of further and further sort of infringing on their rights, and any sort of mobilization taking place. So how do we see this continuous encroachment on activism here? And what do we tell students, others, activists who are involved about the sort of the current situation?
Well, the first thing I would say is that what started at a few university campuses, Columbia and a few others, back in the fall of 2023, really had an enormous impact. It helped to change the way people saw things, and it I think was a world historical moment because it sparked similar activism all over the globe. Now, it also provoked the most ferocious backlash I have ever seen in my life. I've lived more than half my life in the United States, and I've watched how supporters of Israel have managed to turn even unfavorable moments for them around, back after the 1982 war or back after the first Intifada, when Israel was suddenly for the first time seen in a negative light. They managed to turn that around with a powerful counteroffensive. And what we're seeing today is more than a counteroffensive. What we're seeing today is absolute war on any form of Palestinian activism in the name of fighting anti-Semitism, which of course it's not. It's fighting Palestinian activism. Palestinian activism has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. There may be a fringe element of anti-Semitism. It's irrelevant, really, to what's being said here. So you can't talk about Palestine because doing so is anti-Semitic. You can't say Israel is a genocidal power, or that this war is genocidal, or that Israel is an apartheid state. You can't say that. That's anti-Semitic. Well, this is an attempt to shut down an argument they can't win, and they're using repression to do it. So that's the moment that we're in today, and that has been picked up by the Trump administration. It started with the Biden administration, and it's been picked up by the Trump administration. But I think the point to make is that it's much bigger than Palestine. The Trump administration is not simply going after Palestinian activism. It's going after the liberal university. It's going after the structures of education in the United States. They're actually trying to abolish the Department of Education. They're trying to, you should read Christopher Rufo's interview in the New York Times last week. They're trying to dismantle the power of these liberal universities. Now, liberal universities have all kinds of flaws. And one hopes that people will realize that this is not just Palestine. This is academic freedom, freedom of speech, the autonomy of the university. And it's part of a much larger campaign to establish authoritarian standards, which will affect everybody, not just a few activists on campus. This is a broad-based offensive. And Palestine is the wedge issue, or Palestine, as two of my colleagues have said, is a Trojan horse within which they're going to attack issues around race, they're going to attack issues around gender, they're going to attack all kinds of things that the universities have come to symbolize, but which are much broader elements in our society. They're not just attacking Mahmoud Khalil or Columbia University or the universities or Palestinian Solidarity Movement. This is a wedge issue to deal with a much broader set of things, which are their real concern. Many of the people who are driving this are white nationalist anti-Semites. They don't care about anti-Semitism per se. They are using it as a club in order to attack institutions that they see will resist this authoritarian project of theirs. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this. I think it's really important in terms of activism to understand where we are, what moment we are in history, where we are. We are not in Gaza. We are not in Beirut. We are not in Amman or anywhere else in the Arab world. We're in the United States. We're in the country which is the primary sponsor of what is being done in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Lebanon or in many other parts of the Middle East. And everything that people do here, in my view, should be directed to changing that. Now, some people believe, well, the only thing to do is, and then they have an extreme version of what has to be done. Absolute root and branch, change, revolutionary, whatever. Fine, if that's their belief, fine. But I would argue that stopping this war, stopping American support for Israel, I would argue that education around Palestine so that you broaden the camp of people who oppose what is going on there, linking the Palestine struggle to other similar struggles on the broadest possible basis, not just a narrow basis. You're talking about issues of gender, you're talking about issues of race on the broadest possible level. And you're talking about our freedoms, freedom of speech, and in terms of the academy, academic freedom. and the autonomy of the university, not to be pushed around. Now, I have not been in favor of much of what my own university, I'm now retired, the university I used to be associated with, did. But I think whatever you do around Palestine activism should be at least conscious of those broader issues and linked to those broader issues on the broadest possible basis, which means you do not have to have a purity litmus test for everybody you ally with. There are some people who believe only everybody who agrees in the 87 principles, which I have established, is someone that I can even sit down with and ally with. Well, I think that's a means to isolate yourself and lose. You don't win that way. You lose that way. I think you broaden. You deal with people you wouldn't necessarily agree with on some issues. But because you agree on this issue or that issue, I want to stop American arms to Israel. I want to have a ceasefire. I want to end whatever it may be, and use these things to educate. People don't know much about Palestine in the United States. The United States is not a country that has a great global view. It's isolated by two oceans. It's a monoglot country. Yes, many people speak Spanish. Increasing numbers of people speak other languages. But compared to many other countries where second and third language is common, many people in the United States only know English and have never traveled. They don't learn, in most American high schools, they don't learn much about the world. And so it's important to educate. You can't tell people things about, say, genocide or apartheid if you don't explain what is actually going on in Palestine, historically, politically, socially, and not in terms of just concepts. Well, settler colonialism, well, they have to understand what that means in practice in Palestine, what ethnic cleansing means in practice in Palestine, in historical comparison, or in comparison to other similar projects of, say, ethnic cleansing, of, say, apartheid. How is it similar? How is it different? I mean, everything about Zionism is quite unique in some respects. It's a settler colonial project, but it's very different from every other one. It's engaged in ethnic cleansing, but in different ways than other projects. None of them are exactly the same. And that kind of sophistication is actually necessary. That kind of understanding, at least, by activists is necessary. So if you were to ask me, what would I tell activists? The first thing I would tell them is to educate themselves as much as they can. Know as much as they can. And understand that making other people understand those things is going to broaden any coalition that you build. And if you don't do that, you'll alienate people. They won't understand what you're saying. It'll just be slogans. And people are not going to respond to slogans. There's something called an educable moment. And the Gaza war was an educable moment. It's a tragedy, but it was a moment when people learned an enormous amount. The book sales of books on Palestine are phenomenal. And that's because people want to know. And if I were to give any advice to activists, we should be encouraging them. We should be giving people reading lists, and not just reading lists of political tracts, reading lists of literature on Palestine, reading lists of poetry on Palestine, reading lists, obviously, also of history and other things on Palestine. So that would be the advice I would give to activists.
Thank you for that, because I think it's important for them to hear the ways in which they can build solidarity across issues to push back against sort of the taking away of their freedom and the continuing sort of authoritarianism that is existing sort of in our current state. This will sort of be, I hope, the final question before I open it up to the audience, and I already have a number of questions. And this speaks to sort of the growing sort of solidarity and how do we build solidarity. Do you have hope for Palestine? I know that seems pretty straightforward, but if so, what does it look like and what sustains it in the middle of a genocide? If not, why not? And what keeps you going to write and advocate for Palestine?
I do have hope for Palestine. The situation is inordinately grim today. We have an ongoing genocide. There's no guarantee that this war has ended. The specific phase of the war, if you want, the Gaza part of the war. The Israeli military could go back anytime, and there's no guarantee that the United States would do anything to stop it. It hasn't in the past. Trump seems to have wanted to stop it, and did, in a way that Biden was unwilling or unable to do. But there's no guarantee that will continue to be the case, or that Israel will not go back to war. There's a very powerful current in Israeli politics that is intent on resuming the war. And that's grim, because we're talking about a genocidal war starting up again. And the conditions now are leading to possible ethnic cleansing. The conditions now are leading to enormous death rates from exposure, from disease, from untreated wounds, as a result of this ongoing siege of the Gaza Strip, which has not really been lifted. They reimposed it a week ago Sunday. So the situation is grim in that respect, and it's grim in other respects. It's grim in the sense that, leaving aside the increasing direction of Israeli society and leaving aside the support of the administration for the most extreme forms of Israel's political right, the Palestinians are in a very perilous situation themselves because they lack a unified national movement and a clear consensus on strategy. And they've had that at different times in the past, in the 20s and the 30s. It was not a very effective leadership, but it was unified for a time. They had that in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. Again, I've written about my critiques of these leaderships. I'm not saying they were particularly effective or successful. In some respects they were, in some respects they weren't. But at least the Palestinians had a project, a national project, which there was a large degree of consensus on. That's not the case today. And you can't win without those things. You have to have a unified national movement, and you have to have a clear national strategy on which there's a high degree of consensus that's communicable to the rest of the world. The Irish knew what they wanted, and they eventually unified. The Algerians knew what they wanted. They eventually unified. The South Africans, the Vietnamese. Without those things, you don't win. Now, you can resist, and that's another reason for hope. That everything that Zionism has done since 1897 has still not succeeded in the words of Jabotinsky, transforming the land of Palestine into the land of Israel. The Palestinians are still there, half the population from the river to the sea within greater Israel. The sole sovereignty between the river and the sea is the sovereignty of the state of Israel. The platform of the Likud Party in 1977 said, between the sea and the river, there will only be Israeli sovereignty, and they've achieved that. In spite of that, half the population is still Palestinian, and they're still clinging to their land, and they're still resisting in all kinds of different ways. Simply by staying there, they're resisting. Simply by refusing to be pushed out, they're resisting. Again, that's a cause of hope. That and the fact that the younger generation seems to be inspired by yet a new spirit of resistance. And I'm not just talking about in the diaspora in the United States or in the Arab world. I'm talking about all across, the Palestinian society, whether in the Arab world, whether in the West, whether in Chile, wherever. It's not universal, but it is striking that has been the case. So all of these, to my way of thinking, are sources of hope, as well as the last thing I'll say is that without this metropole, United States and Europe, Israel can't do what it does. And they no longer have the support that they once had. They never lacked overwhelming majority support in the Western world. Never in the history of modern political Zionism did they lack overwhelming political, in the British Conservative Party, the British Liberal Party, the British Labour Party, the American Democratic Party, American Republican Party, the British media, the American media, the French media, every French political party, from the beginning until the last 10 years. Now, they still have political support at the elite level, but public opinion, they're losing. They're losing. In some countries, they've lost it. Spain, Ireland, Belgium, a few other European countries. They've lost public opinion. Majorities of public opinion have decisively shifted to a position critical of Israel and supportive of the Palestinians. That has yet to happen in terms of the elites and the political level in most Western countries. But at the level of public opinion, there are dramatic shifts underway. And to my way of thinking, if that can continue, in spite of this fierce counterattack that's being launched all across the Western world, that's a source of hope.